So imagine that you're a CPO. Imagine that you've just landed in the organization and you are tasked with driving procurement. So where do you start? So in the room, just shout it out and I'll repeat it. If you're online, if you just put something into Mentimeter, I will read that out as well. So tell me now, where do you start? Say again? Spend analysis. How much do you spend? Okay, what else? Where else do you start? Tell me now. Impact analysis. So we've got spend analysis and impact analysis. What else?
Or just start anywhere.
Start anywhere. Okay, I like that. What else? Cross-functional commitment. You can't do this on your own. You need to get the other parts of the organization in behind you. Yes? What else? Where else do you start? Okay, it's hard, right? It's hard. Say again? Supplier base. In other words, which suppliers might be the worst suppliers or where you have the biggest problems. Right, that's a really good place to start. And online, if anyone wants to enter stuff into Mentimeter, just do that as we go and I'll read that along. So where do you start? You know, it's a pretty daunting task. Well, actually, remember what I said at the start. We already have the tools to do this. Remember this old tool? You know, you dust it off. When was the last time, in the room, raise your hand, when was the last time you did a pestle analysis? One hand, two hands, three, okay. 5 hands, there's about 100 people here in the room. 5 hands went up. Pestle analysis, you know, we know that tool. It is a beautifully elegant tool. Start there for the organization, for your suppliers, for a single supplier. Start for a category that you buy, great place to start. Quick win, somebody says online. Also, what are your hotspots? Now, hotspots is a really key concept when it comes to sustainability, because a hotspot is about looking at the things that are likely to give us a problem. I used to be an electronics engineer, and I love opening things up and taking them apart. And I can't really do this now because everything's become unmendable, built-in obsolescence, another problem. Let's not go there now. But I used to be able to open something up, and I used to be able to figure out what had gone wrong with it. And usually you'd open something up, and you'd kind of look for a burnt component, or you'd look for something that was wrong, and if that failed, you'd kind of see, was there power getting through to half of the thing, and if so, you know, the fault was somewhere else. You'd look at hotspots. As an electronics engineer, I'd start with the power supply. You know, I knew where to look because they were the obvious starting points, and 90% of the time, that's where the issue was. So we can do that with sustainability. We can say, okay, if we're buying a thing, if we are dealing with a supplier, if we are looking at a supply chain, what are the hotspots? Which are the ones that we should look at? Give me some hotspots. Think of the different types of hotspots that you know about. Online or Mentimeter, just put the word in, or in the room, just shout it out. What sort of hotspots can you think about? Logistics, because we're burning a lot of carbon, we're shipping things around the world. Yeah, what else? Subcontractors, because we don't know what they're doing. Right, what else? Geography, where in the world they're based. And we know that what happens in some countries is much less controlled than in other countries, and that there are natural impacts that exist in some territories than others. Yeah, others, please. Use of chemicals. So we could look at the industry sectors that use chemicals. We look at where in the world those chemicals get used. We could look at what happens to those chemicals after they're used. Any others? Follow the money. I like that. That's really good, because you can bet that wherever the money goes is where the impact's going to go, because that's, you know, people want to maximize profit. So there are 3 types of hotspots we can look at. We can look at geographical hotspots. There are parts of the world where we know there is lots of biodiversity and deforestation. There are parts of the world where we know human rights are infringed. We can look at processes. You know, if I asked you to make a list of the top 10 processes that have the greatest impact, you could do that here. You know that stuff. cement making, steel production, soybean production, palm oil, all of those things. And then the types of product. So there are particular products that are more harmful than others. So we know this stuff. So start with the hotspots. In the book, there's a list of hotspots that I've put out there as to get it going. But, actually do your own research, because there's a world of information out there. Have your own list of hotspots you're using to do this stuff. Because what we need to do, once we've got our procurement goals, is we need to focus on three things: what we buy, who we buy from, and our supply chains. And each of these three needs a slightly different approach. If we're thinking about category management, yeah, it's all part of the same thing, but actually this is part of supplier relationship management, this is part of supply chain management, it's part of good strategic procurement. And when we think about what we buy, suddenly we're interested in a whole bunch of things. So what is the product? What is the category? What are the services that make it up? What materials are used to make it? What are the processes? And we can say, hey, that's a hotspot process. We need to focus on that stuff. Where do these things come from? Now, when we've done category management up until now, and typically sourcing hasn't really asked those questions, because we haven't necessarily needed to understand original sources for things that form the products and services that we provide. What are the emissions generated? Whoa, that's a new thing. We've not done that before. Beginning to understand how much CO2 equivalent might have been burnt to produce a particular thing or deliver a service. And who's delivering that? How sustainable is it? That's quite easy, because we're used to understanding categories, products, and goods, so we can begin to ask that question, because we've got a physical thing in front of us, and we can have a look at it and say, okay, let's take it apart, let's figure this out. Less easy is who we buy from. Our suppliers. Maybe we might know our immediate suppliers, but how do we really know them? Do we really understand everything about them? Are we visited them, but have we visited the other factory in a remote location? Do we know what happens there? Do we know how much emissions are generated? Anybody here ask your suppliers to tell you what their CO2 equivalent is? Raise your hand if you've asked suppliers to give you that information. Okay, a handful, right. Who here has had success in getting good emissions information from their suppliers? No hands. One hand. It is the hardest thing in the world to do right now, because you ask your supplier, what's your CO2? What are the emissions that you're producing? And their response will be, we might need a bit of help. We're going to get back to you on that. I mean, that's good, because everybody's getting out there trying to figure out how to do this stuff, but it's really early days. How sustainable are they? So suddenly we need to understand our suppliers. And don't think that the assessment rating systems out there is the answer. It's early days. Lots of companies providing assessment rating systems for sustainability for companies. Most of those are based upon questionnaires, ticking the boxes. They are not real information about what actually happens. It's the first necessary step. Actually, the future is about data and digital, and how you can know in real time how much electricity your suppliers are consuming at that moment, how much water they're consuming, how much carbon they're producing, and so on. Data and digital will answer that for us, but today it's a bit hit and miss. And then we've got our supply chains. So what happens in the supply chain? What are the geographies involved? Where does it travel through? What are the suppliers? What are the logistics involved in doing that? How can things change? If you understand a supply chain today, could that change and actually tomorrow it's completely different? And where are the emissions generated? If you think it's hard to understand the emissions from your immediate suppliers, think how hard it is to understand the emissions in an entire supply chain, because your suppliers don't know that. So you've got to help them figure that out. And who's involved? How are those people treated? So when we start to look at this, data understanding becomes a key inhibitor. So we need different approaches here. So let's just sum up the journey so far. So we have our vision, our goals, we have our procurement goals. we're looking at the focus areas. We're thinking about what we buy, who we buy from, and our supply chains. And then we need to begin to figure out what we're going to do. We need a prioritized assessment of what we're going to do to be able to drive change. Now, this is the bit of the presentation where it gets a little bit dull and technical. So just try and bear with me on this, because this is quite a hard and long concept to explain, but it's the necessary step to be able to do this. There are 3 levels to this. It starts with a risk assessment. We have to assess who we buy, what we buy, who we buy from in our supply chains in terms of risk. In other words, if something goes wrong, how much could that hurt us? Because we're not meeting legislation or we get exposed for doing that. And if you're used to assessing risk in procurement, then it's the same tool. You look at the likelihood of the risk occurring, you look at the severity of the impact should that risk occur, and you say, here's a risk, what do I do with that risk? Okay, I need some mitigation action, or I need some contingency plans. So you come up with a project or initiative to fix the risk. You've all done that stuff. It's the stuff we do in procurement. So we do it with sustainability in mind, with our sustainability hat on. That's level 1. Let's look at some risks here. So if we are sourcing soya beans, what sort of risk hotspots, what are the sort of risks that we might be concerned about sourcing soya beans? Tell me now on Mentimeter, or tell me in the room, please. What sort of risk with soya beans? Pollution, yes. What else? Land deforestation, yes. Anything else? Okay, let's do sand. For sand, any risks from doing from sourcing sand? What would you say for sourcing sand? Put it on a Mentimeter. So and several people said deforestation for soybeans as well, and using land deforestation. Bad harvest for soybeans. Use of water and land. Yep. Okay. For sand, tell me about sand now. What are the risks there? Transport, erosion, online. Okay. Anything else? Sand mafia is one of the key ones, and use of resources, CO2, use of CO2, sand labor related risks, criminality and mafia. Thank you. Online. What about coconuts? What sort of risks are there with coconuts? In the room, shout it out. Child labor, yeah. Tell me online as well. Human rights, online. And the other one is the use of monkeys to pick the coconuts. Animal welfare issues. So you can begin to look at the products that you're sourcing really easily, and you can begin to identify those risks using the hotspots. That's the starting point. Okay, the second level here, we need to understand impacts. Now these are different to risks. Impacts is where we've set a goal. Let's say we've set a goal to be net zero by 2035 in our organization. So we've done the risks, but what we now want to know is what are the big carbon consuming areas that are preventing us from achieving that net zero target? What are the impacts that stand in the way of us producing our goal? So that's the second bit. And again, we can assess that in terms of relevance and the significance of that impact. And the third level is where we are looking at what are the opportunities where we could drive sustainable action and get benefit, whether that's value or cost or whatever that might be. And again, we can look at that. What are the benefits and how easy is that going to be to realize that? So if you're sitting there or watching this thinking, I've kind of lost this bit, that's okay, because I do explain it in the book. But the point with this is we've got to go through this process to understand where to focus. So we look at the risks, we look at the impacts, we look at the opportunities, and we bring all of that together. I call it the prioritization cube, prioritization heat cube, which is about identifying what are the things we're going to do that focus on risk, impacts, and opportunities. And that allows us to create a sustainable roadmap. Now, let me go back to when I talked to you about choice, because if we look at the choice we have, actually these map to that. So if we have made the choice only to meet regulatory obligations and manage a bit of risk, all we're going to do is focus on risks. But if our choice is around growth and advantage, then we want to be able to identify those impacts that stop us being the company or organization we want to be. And then if we're seeing opportunity, maybe that's where we're driving environmental and social value. So if we do this well, then all of this leads to us having a sustainable procurement roadmap. The projects and the initiatives we are going to do over the next 18 months, 3 years, 10 years, we need those different kind of degrees of focus. What are the projects and the initiatives that we're going to do around what we buy, who we buy from, and in our supply chains? And if we can have that roadmap, that's the starting point. Now, I'm 45 minutes into this. Some of you are looking like I'm 45 minutes into this as well in the room. Hopefully everybody online is still there. It's taken me 45 minutes to get to the point where here is the plan. But the reason it's taken that so long is because this is where you've got to start. You can't do sustainable procurement unless you know what you're doing. And all of those steps, and that alignment has to happen before you can get to that point. And then we've got to put our sustainability hat on, and we've got to get on and do that. And the good news, as I've already said, is this is where we use all of the processes and the approaches and the tools and the things that we know and love if we are doing sustainable procurement, like category management.